Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. It's like, yeah. The other thing about marriage, this is really worth knowing too, is that I learned this in part from reading Jung. It's like, what do you do when you get married? That's easy. You take someone who's just as useless and horrible as you are, and then you shackle yourself to them. And then you say, we're not running away, no matter what happens. Yeah, well, that's perfect, because then you don't get to run away. And the thing is like, if you can run away, you can't tell each other the truth. Because if you tell someone the truth about you and they don't run away, they weren't listening. And so if you don't have someone around that can't run away, then you can't tell them the truth. And so that's part of the purpose of the marriage. It's like, okay, I'll bet on you, you bet on me. It's a losing bet, we both know that. But given our current circumstances, we're unlikely to find anyone better. That's for sure. You know, there's two things that come off of that. One is, you know, people are waiting around to find Mr. or Mrs. Right. It's like, here's something to think about, man, to put yourself on your feet right. If you went to a party and you found Mr. Right, and he looked at you and didn't run away screaming, that would indicate that he wasn't Mr. Right at all, right? It's like the old Nietzschean joke, if someone loves you, that should immediately disenchant you with them. Right, or it's the Woody Allen joke, I'd never belong to a club that would take me as a member. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. And so you're going to shackle yourself to someone who's just as imperfect as you are. And then the issue is you might be in a situation where you can actually negotiate, because you might think, well, there's some things about you that aren't going so right, and there's some things about me that aren't going so right, and we're bloody well stuck with the consequences for the next 50 years. So we can either straighten this out, or we can suffer through it for the next 5 decades. And you know, people are of the sort that without that degree of seriousness, those problems will not be solved. You'll leave things unnamed, because there's always an out. It's like, and it's the same thing when you're living together with someone. You know that people who live together before they're married are more likely to get divorced, not less likely. And the reason for that is, what exactly are you saying to one another when you live with each other? Just think about it. Well, for now, you're better than anything else I can trick. But I'd like to reserve the right to trade you in. Conveniently, if someone better happens to stumble into me. Well, how could someone not be insulted to their core by an offer like that? Now, they're willing to play along with it because they're going to do the same thing with you. Now, well, that's exactly it. It's like, yeah, I know you're not going to commit to me, so that means you don't value me or our relationship above everything else. But as long as I get to escape if I need to, then I'm willing to put up with that. It's like, that's a hell of a thing. I mean, you might think, how stupid is it to shackle yourself to someone? It's like, it's stupid, man. There's no doubt about that. But compared to the alternatives, it's pretty damn good. Because without that shackling, there are things you will never, ever learn, because you'll avoid them. You can always leave. And if you can leave, then you don't have to tell each other the truth. It's as simple as that, because you can just leave. And then you don't have anyone you can tell the truth to. So there's some representations of the idea of the original. It's not, this isn't all Adam. This is an old Chinese symbol. I think it's Faxianua, although I think I have the pronunciation wrong, but it's really cool. See the snakes down here? They're kind of like a DNA symbol, which I find very interesting. And so that's the original cosmic serpent. That's sort of the potential out of which that emerges. And then that's the differentiation of that into male and female. And so that's like the predatory unknown. That's one way of thinking about it. That's the most fundamental conception of mankind, is something like that, is the predatory unknown. And then the bifurcation of that into the two fundamental cognitive elements of human perception, masculine and female. And you see the same thing here. This is Chinese, this is Egyptian, also extraordinarily old. It's the great serpent that underlies everything, bifurcating itself into Isis, queen of the underworld, and Osiris, king of Pharaoh, king of order. You see the same thing in an old alchemical symbol. I love this one. It looks quite a lot like the little thing that Harry Potter chases around, eh? Yeah, and that's not accidental, by the way, because the seeker is the thing that chases this, and the seeker that chases this and catches it wins. And that's a really old idea, and how the hell J.K. Rowling knew that, I cannot figure out, because that is a very, very archaic symbol, arcane symbol. On Google, it's called the round chaos. And the only reference to the round chaos that I can find on Google is on my webpage. And so I have no idea how Rowling came up with that. I mean, I know she looked at a lot of old texts, but the idea that if you play the metagame and you catch this, you win all the games is exactly right. And that's the motif for, what's the name of that? Quidditch. Yeah. So there's the potential. That's like the potential out of which God made the world at the beginning of time. And what emerges out of that is some kind of, that's the dragon, you know, in the dragon fight. That's partly the serpent that's in the Garden of Eden. And then that's the manifestation of masculine and feminine out of that. Potential, predatory, unknown, masculine and feminine. It's like a single representation of the evolutionary history of human cognitive consciousness. So cool. And that's also an image of the ideal. It's the union of sun and moon, and it's this hyper creature, hermaphroditic, that's also the Adam and Eve that existed at the beginning of time before the fall. And it's the purpose of marriage. All of that as a sacrament, all of that in these images, it's just absolutely unbelievable what images can pack into them. And there's some more classical representations of Eve being extracted from Adam. And this is a cool line. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Well, see, someone who wrote that would only write that like that if they were surprised that they weren't ashamed, because why would you point it out otherwise? And so there's this intimation that of two things. Number one is there was a point in time when human beings were naked and they weren't ashamed of it, and there is a point of time, which is now, where they're naked and they are ashamed of it. And then the question is, well, what's the association with nakedness and shame? And that's also often given a sexual connotation in classic interpretations of the Adam and Eve story, because of its association with nudity, I presume. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So you think, I noticed my daughter, she probably won't be very happy that I'm revealing this in this lecture, but my daughter was never really concerned about nudity when she was a little kid. It was all the same to her one way or another. But my son, by the time he was 3, man, that kid was private. His bedroom door was shut, the bathroom door was shut. It was like, get the hell out of here. And that seemed to just happen of its own accord. And, you know, we had 2 children, and one was like that and the other one wasn't. I didn't think we had much to do with it at all, but it was really fascinating to watch that emerge in him. And, you know, that sense of self-consciousness does seem to emerge in children somewhere around the age of 3. And, you know, that's generally also when we start thinking that maybe having your baby wander around naked on a beach isn't exactly the best idea. There's something like that. The nudity in children is generally okay under some circumstances in public display. We seem to think of that as merely, it's acceptable. Why? I don't know. Why it stops being acceptable, well, that has something to do with sexuality, obviously, but it's a very complicated phenomena. But, you know, the whole nudity thing is a very complicated thing. I mean, first of all, people are kind of strange because we're hairless, roughly, you know, compared to most animals. And we don't know why that is. Some people think it's because we lost our hair when we were wandering around in the desert, running around in Africa, because we're really, really good runners. We can run down animals, say. Like a human being in good shape can run a horse to death in a week. We can really run, man. And a lot of our ancestors, the Kalahari Bushmen, still do this. They just run an animal for till it dies. And the bushman doesn't die. I mean, they also sometimes shoot them with poison arrows, but they can just run them until they die. So we have tremendous endurance, and you have to be able to get rid of a lot of heat if you're going to run around in the desert, so we don't have much hair. That's one explanation. And Buckminster Fuller had an interesting explanation, which was he thinks that at some point during our evolution, we spend a lot of time near the water, and so we're like fish apes, something like that. Well, you know, we like to be on the beach, and there's lots of food there, and we like to swim, and we're really good at swimming for terrestrial creatures. And we cry salt tears like some sea-going creatures do, and women have a layer of subcutaneous fat like some sea-going creatures do. And we have kind of, our feet, which are very odd things, are kind of good for flapping in the water, although we can also walk with them. And so he thought that maybe that adaptation was to a water existence, like seals and so forth. Like we kind of went back to the ocean, but not quite. And so, but anyways, the evolution of that, hairlessness is an interesting thing, but it certainly does make us exposed to the world in a way that animals that have a covering of fur aren't. And then we're upright, which is very strange because most animals aren't. They're on all fours, and so their very vulnerable parts are protected and not exposed to view. And then of course when you're standing up nude, let's call it your psychophysiological quality is on painful display, right? And people complain about that all the time. You know, if you look at the feminist tack, for example, on beauty, the idea that women have eating disorders is directly attributed to the presence of too many beautiful women on the cover of magazines, something like that. Even though women buy those magazines and they're attracted to them and their mood goes up when they purchase them. And if the stimulus was negative, the women would avoid the magazines and not buy them. So as a theory, it's a very, very bad one. But it's still the case that, you know, it's still the case that standards of beauty shame people, and that's for sure, and everyone, because if you're not ugly now, man, you're going to be at some point in your life. So that's kind of a rough thing to contend with, right? It's a rough thing to know that there's an ideal that you could be, and maybe even once were, that you're not going to be for long, or never were. And it's really an appalling issue, because I think it's harder on women, because women are judged by men more for their youth and fertility. That's how it turns out from the evolutionary point of view. Men are judged more on their socioeconomic status by women.